noted and knowledgeable analyst, whether the legislature did to us or for us in their legislative session. We are so thrilled that you are here to participate in the process, because if you don't know what's going on, you can't do very much about it. You just float on top of the water. And I don't think any of us want to be flotsam. So without further ado, let me first of all invite all of you to join Leaders with Vision. You'll find the green application on the table as you go out, or Shirley, if you raise your hand, Shirley will be happy to bring it to you. And we already have one new member, Jeff Sanford. Welcome, Jeff. Thank you for joining. Together, we can make things happen in Louisiana, even in Louisiana. Okay? So let's start off the lineup with Robert Travis Scott.
Thank you, Jean, and thanks for putting this on every year. I think she saw I was making a few notes to myself, so she wanted me to be more spontaneous. You know, I remember talking to Mr. Ilario, who at that time was in the House when I was with the Times-Picayune as their Capitol Bureau Chief. And as the session ended, you know, Wynn said hello to him, and he said, well, now we can all go home and you guys can tell us what we did. And the fact of the matter is there's probably no one person at this moment in time who really understands everything that happened. So we can try to shed light on a few things here and there. I'm president of the Public Affairs Research Council. We had a real interest in following this session. We picked out a number of issues that were important to us. Our overall view of the session coming out of it is contained in a commentary that we just put out this morning. I have some copies here, but it's also on our website, parlouisiana.org. I mean, overall, the process, I think, was a more interesting civics lesson than one we've had in a long time. There was a lot more bicameral and bipartisan cooperation that brought the budget together. That really was the main topic of the session, because the governor on the very first day parked his tax plan. He kind of failed to inspire the legislature to repeal the income tax, and he really offered no other motivation or guidance on where the session should go from there. But the legislature then focused on what was probably a much more difficult budget than we've seen in a long time. We had this massive federal funding cut in health care. We had these public-private partnerships at the hospitals that are being implemented, and we almost never got good numbers on what the heck was going on with that, even though we were promised it day to day. There were these court rulings that came up in the middle of the session that had to reshuffle the education funding. And then we have the old problems of retirement and, of course, the tax exemptions. And all these things made this budget cycle, I think, maybe a lot tougher than it usually is. But in terms of the process, there was, like I said, probably better bicameral and bipartisan relations coming together to make this budget than we've seen in a while. And there was a streak of independence in the House that I think was probably healthy and favorable. Probably some of your greatest tensions were within the parties themselves, within the GOP and within the Democratic Party. That's probably where you had your greatest divisions, you know, in terms of how this rolled out. But you know, the main message that we have in our commentary is that even though we appreciate the process, and now everyone's been holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and they have their Kumbaya moment, now we need to look at what really happened. And the fact of the matter is, you know, we're continuing to obligate ourselves to greater costs in the future. This budget for FY14 is pretty close to the same amount of money for the current year. But we're piling up more and more things for the future that are going to continue to cause us problems. I'll just name a few of those. I'm sure y'all are aware of the many things that happened. We had, and I'm not necessarily criticizing any of these particular programs and saying they're not worthwhile. I'm just saying, we're adults, this is the day after the party, and we need to look at what we're obligating ourselves to. There was the extra $69 million for local schools and teacher pay, something that made this gentleman very happy over here, I'm sure. And they've obligated, they have at least indicated they want to continue to do that in future years, to have this increase and maybe more. There were new tax credits, the new markets tax credits, the investors tax credits, the import-export tax credits. There was a $250 million program to build buildings for community technical colleges in almost every Senate district across the state. And, you know, that's going to create a financial obligation year to year to pay for that. Don't get me wrong, there were some good projects in there. I think the project that they're building here for car maintenance and repair is a terrific program. But it's still going to be a long-term obligation. And then you had the retirement issues that continue to be a strain. We have a cash balance program that the governor has proposed, and that might offer some long-term relief when it's implemented, but its implementation has been delayed. We have the movie tax credits. We've now spent more than $1 billion on those. They continue to grow, and none of the refinements or none of the targeting for those programs was implemented, even though the Department of Economic Development and an economist study said we needed to fix those. We have a transportation trust fund that has been flat for 10 years, and our means of trying to finance our highways and roads needs a complete reexamination. Our inventory tax credit program that is a cost to the state is growing faster than the inventory tax itself. This is a built-in cost thing that you don't hear very much about. You're going to be hearing more about it. And then we have these, oh, by the way, the whole government computer software system and infrastructure system, they continue to delay implementation of that. And then, of course, we have all these incredible gray areas. We have these public-private partnerships from the hospitals for which we have not been given, I think, a sufficient amount of transparency and information. And what we've seen already is that the cost of these is already going up much higher than we had anticipated even just a few months ago. Now, maybe in the long run, and I hope this is true, I hope in the long run these will produce a cost savings. But right now, that is a very big gray area and could be another big cost item for us in the future. There's the Medicaid program itself. Even though I think the Bayou Health program may be bringing a lot of efficiencies to our Medicaid spending, it's continuing to rise. Don't forget the Supreme Court rulings on the vouchers and the course choice program. We've removed that from the MFP, so you're going to have to find other sources if you're going to keep that program going. The tax amnesty program will infuse short-term money, but you're going to be pulling from revenue in the future to make that happen. I could go on. There's just so many things that we have built up into our system that aren't really reflected in the balanced budget for FY14. There are just a lot of concerns as we go down the road that just aren't being addressed. And I'll stop there and we can maybe take some more questions later.
Okay. Thank you, and I need to offer Robert an apology. I didn't properly introduce you because I thought everybody already knew you. So I won't make that mistake in the future. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Albert Samuels, who is a poli-sci, Dean of Poli-sci at Southern University. Albert, come on up.
Good afternoon. I'm partially not sure if I should consider this a compliment or an insult to be referred to as the dean of political science. First of all, I'm actually the chair department chair of the Department of Political Science. Okay. I'm sure it would be news to my dean to know that he'd been replaced.
Sorry about that.
He'd been replaced.
I promoted you.
And especially consider the fact that a lot of times we joke as department chairs because a lot of times we are given, we are inherently given oftentimes problems that we cannot solve. That in actuality, a lot of times it's actually a demotion rather than a promotion, and then you want to make me dean. So, so again, I don't know whether I should be thrilled or insulted, but nevertheless, it's good to be here today to talk about a little bit about what happened in session. And I think that probably, to summarize, you can summarize my comments by saying that Louisiana politicals and voters this time around got a pretty basic.
You're now back to professional.
Okay. Now I feel better. Louisiana politicals and perhaps our citizens got a civics lesson, a very basic civics lessons this time around, and the basic principle that perhaps even in Louisiana there are 3 branches of government. Perhaps Louisiana voters in recent years could have been forgiven for perhaps not realizing that, given our political culture and our political history. I like to tell my students, in my Louisiana politics students, I try to refer to this analogy that John McGinnis has used in some of his books that I've used in the past, analogy about how one of the Spanish governors, how he dealt with some unruly New Orleans residents who ran out the first governor. And in some ways, the moral, cut to the quick, the moral of the story is he argues that in many ways, Louisiana never outgrew its colonial past in some ways. And so and certainly in recent years, Governor General, in some ways, which he has had sway over lawmakers, is really consistent with a historical pattern. However, in this session, it's amazing the difference that a year can make. Just over a year ago, Governor General, March 2012, 61% approval rating, fresh off a very easy re-election, actually a serious potential choice for as a vice president for the GOP, steamroll an education reform package, in record time through both chambers, and he, it looked pretty powerful. Going into this session, his approval down 22 points. He was more unpopular than Barack Obama. And that takes some doing in Louisiana. In 2008, the only state where Obama did worse was Utah. So how quickly his fortunes has failed. What we thought was going to be the central issue of the session, his tax reform proposal, basically died on the first day of the session. The governor waved the white flag and admitted defeat. You knew it was over when Lobby came out against it. The party was over. It was over for everything but the shouting. The legislature declined the governor's offer to come up with their own plan, and instead they rewrote his budget, which included $400 million initially of one-time money. Most of it would have impacted higher ed. And so behind a lot of this, the underlying problem to explain a lot of this, the problems really began before this session. The governor took the opportunity that he saw in June and July of last year, when with the huge cut, with the huge Medicaid cut, and the Supreme Court's affirming the court CARE Act, to essentially try to privatize the charity hospital system. While he may accomplish that goal as a policy goal, he has paid a huge political price for it. And that was the beginning of the erosion of General Starr. But there's some deeper problems here, and it's a problem that happens frequently to politicians. who misconstrue elections, victories as mandates. The truth of the matter is, Jindal has been one of the luckiest politicians in American politics. He came to power in Louisiana at a period of historic weakness by the Democratic Party, and so sometimes people mistake their victories as a mandate, when in fact is probably more reflection of the gross inability of the Democratic Party in recent years to offer a credible alternative to Jindal's agenda. But he made this. So this is an example of what we call hubris, and that is played out in not only just the decision to privatize the charity hospital system, it's the decision to believe that he did not have to explain why we were privatizing the charity hospital system. It's probably that fact, more than the fact that he actually tried to privatize it, that has a lot to do with why his numbers have gone down. And on top of that, with the recurring fiscal issues, you had a fundamental breakdown in trust between the administration and specifically House Republicans, who just, quite frankly, just said, we don't trust the numbers. And you had a coalition to come together that many of us would not have predicted months ago, of actually House Republicans, the so-called fiscal hawks, and House Democrats creating a very different budget. So that's on one hand. And then the Louisiana Supreme Court makes an appearance. The Supreme Court actually says that the voucher program, which was the signature part of the education reform package, was unconstitutionally funded because it came out of the MFP program. So that forced lawmakers and the governor to try to scramble to find a different way to fund their program, and even I would even argue even that was unconstitutional. But that's on federal ground. That's a whole nother issue. So we got the legislature rebelling. We have the Supreme Court showing that it does have the right to overturn the actions of the governor. However, the governor is still not irrelevant, and he's able, and in some ways, he was able to show that by not so much by getting his way in some cases, but by preventing things from happening that he was opposed to. For example, the governor and his allies were able to beat back several attempts to expand the Medicaid program as part of the Affordable Care Act. And in fact, that were the last days of the session that led to some interesting charges about racism that we can talk about later. They also were able to scuttle a compromise reached in the House originally over the budget that would have only funded these tax exemptions, these 468 tax exemptions at the time. We added a few more, by the way, only at 85% of that value. The governor was able to bring in all these aggrieved, poor business groups who benefit from these tax cuts, and so how horrible it would be for economic development if we only got 85% of our tax exemption as opposed to 100%. And the fiscal hawks caved real quickly on the threats that we will remember you at election time, and so which led to some people calling them not just fiscal hawks, but a different kind of hawk. So they were able to beat that back. Ultimately, the budget still came out a whole lot different than what the governor had originally planned. As for also the governor was able to get the public-private partnerships, more of those approved. Initially, we started off with a session in which lawmakers questioning the authority of the government to do this without their approval. By the end of the session, they were approving agreements they had not completely read and agreements that that were lacking pages of details. So in some ways, the governor was still able to show that he was still relevant. Couple quick points I want to make before I sit down. Another issue of both local significance but also statewide significance was the failure for a second year in a row for a breakaway district in Southeast Baton Rouge school district to be enacted. In the last day of the session, that measure died because they couldn't get enough votes to put on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. This session was also finally big blows to the principle of transparency. Another bill that to try to open up more information from the governor's office would fail, which is not a surprise. But the big failure is on these public-private partnerships. We're talking about a major change in taking public hospitals, giving these basically to private companies. We don't know how much it's going to cost, what are the details, and what are the secret things that we have promised to these new hospital corporations. All that has been withheld, not only from lawmakers but from the public. That is a huge problem going forward.
Why are they doing it? Does anybody know why they want to do it?
We'll save that for Q&A. Final thing, kudos to the Advocate, the Times-Picayune, and to the Daily Reveille for suing LSU Board of Supervisors about the about the brazen attempt, about the brazen efforts of the LSU Board of Supervisors to hide from the public the process they went through in choosing their president. They won at a lower court level. I see no way that LSU is going to win this lawsuit, and it is and nor should they win. And so I'm going to take my seat.
Thank you, Alfred. And since you brought up the Advocate and the transparency as an issue, I want to remind everybody today is the end of an era. It is Carl Redmond's last day. And Carl, when you watch this tape, happy trails. And we'll be working with you on transparency in the future. One of our next speaker is Glenn Kemp, and yes, I do know your title. You've had it so long. I got it memorized. He is Secretary of the Senate. Would you welcome Glenn Kemp?
Thank you, Gene. It's kind of hard where Butch and I stand to really evaluate what we do good and what we do bad and what we've really done, because everything comes flying through our desk, and I kind of know a lot of stuff that passes the Senate, but what eventually happens to it, it takes me a few days to figure out, and I think Butch is on the same schedule with that. And like I thought we had done some pretty good things. The Senate came up with the idea of putting money in the budget for some one-time money for teachers. That was a Senate idea. When I got here, I found out that may not have been such a good idea. I got school board members and school lobbyists who were kind of jumping all over us about what we did and how bad it was an idea. So maybe I could assure you that the Senate would love to have that $69 million back to do something else if it wasn't such a good idea. But what a lot of things you think is a good idea, when we're doing them, maybe they, after the fact, aren't as great as we think they are, but in the heat of the battle, I think that you've got 39 members of the Senate and 105 members of the House, and you've got to have at least a majority on each side that come up with ideas that they think is the best thing to do for the state and for the people. Obviously, we haven't had a really strong leadership role from the governor, as before it's been talking about, and that's real true. His popularity has reduced, as you can see from what has happened from the beginning, certainly in the difference in the past. The executive in Louisiana is probably the most powerful executive in the country. And historically, the executive in Louisiana, or the governor, has been an extremely powerful governor compared to other governors across the nation. He has that line item veto, which is really a very powerful pen that he has, or she, whoever it might be in the office at the time. And truthfully, term limits has created more power in the executive branch. That's a study that has been done from the National Conference of State Legislatures, and they found that the net results of term limits is that the executive branch becomes more powerful. You have a much bigger turnover in the legislative branch, and you don't have that long-term people that are there, so the governor becomes more powerful. We certainly have, starting out with the most powerful governor, now we got term limits. This governor hit at the perfect time. He came in on the first time that term limits came into effect, and you saw probably that certainly that first 4 years was the most powerful influence of a governor it's ever been. That's starting to cut back, and I believe that in his popularity, as he talked about popularity in the state of Louisiana was less than Obama's, was kind of interesting. I think his popularity is going to be less and less over the next 2 years because he is term limited. He is going to, you know, he's going to go by the way of wherever he decides to go after this. I will just mention a couple things. This time, the Senate introduced 262 Senate bills. That's the least that I can remember since I've been there. And I went to work in the Senate in the House actually, in 1972. Butch and I started about the same time as students. And that's the least number of bills that I can remember being introduced at a session, at a regular session. And I'm not sure about the House. Butch can speak to that. Interesting enough, out of that, 146 of them passed. And percentage-wise, that's incredible. We never passed that high percentage. We also introduced 131 Senate concurrent resolutions. Most of those passed. We had 207 Senate resolutions. And Senate concurrent and Senate resolutions do everything from urgent request a lot of studies to be made, urgent request departments to do certain things, authorize and direct things to happen across the board, to a lot of condolence resolutions and a lot of commendations. When we commend everybody and their brother for any high school that wins a state championship or does good to whatever. But we do a lot of those. But in the bills themselves that we've dealt with, 38 out of that 146 that passed were local. So we do deal with a lot of local, and this was one of those limited sessions where, before the session starts, basically it's a session that deals with tax issues. We can have a limited number of general bills, and we have somewhat unlimited number of local bills, so we do deal with that to a degree. I'll just mention a couple things. It was, in addition, obviously, the budget process took a tremendous amount of time and the attention of both sides. And at the end of that process, and we will continue to see what happened from that, I think that one of the things that certainly on the Senate side that senators recognize, and Hilario, the president of the Senate, who also served, I think, twice as Speaker of the House and had a number of years in the House, recognize that that's the most and closest work that he can ever remember across the two chambers working together. And when you look at the total result of what the Senate passed and then what was finally sent to the House that they rejected, and then we went to conference committee, there's not a lot of difference between what we did and what finally came out, but there were differences, and those differences were to the people that pushed them and the hawks that he talked about, and some of the Democratic caucus over there. Those were extremely important to him, and we did come up with some answers to that. A couple things to pay attention to, I think. Talked about the public-private hospital funding. We've eaten up with the 4 hospitals that we've done so far. I think it's 4. And we got about 6 more on the coming up. And with the one we've already done, I think we've eaten up about 94% of the total funds available for that. So that's a real question about where we're going to fund those. And that's been a question that keeps coming up and keeps popping up. We don't know about those. Something happened Wednesday. The State Civil Service Commission refused to approve the layoff of 3,000 employees in these hospitals. Now, they had already approved the previous ones for the other hospitals, but these future ones, and 3,000 employees, if they can't lay those 3,000 off, we hadn't prepared for that. I heard a number, I don't know how good it is because I'm not in that, not real close to that division, but I heard a number of $200 million hole. That's significant. The word out there is that LSU did not provide sufficient information to the Civil Service Commission for them to make a informed decision about the layoffs and the approval of those. Yesterday, LSU was saying that they were providing them with the necessary information that they requested, and there will hopefully be a rehearing on this on Monday. So we'll just, that's a wait and see to see what happens. Can't tell you where that goes. In the Senate side, we did a number of laws, a lot of criminal law, and changed some laws on criminal law. A lot of that was to match what happened in court decisions. One was a burning case up in North Louisiana that the courts found that it didn't meet specifically the state law on it, and so we amended to take care of that. Louisiana still remains the front runner on pro-life, and any time that someone can think of something else to do to make it harder for abortions, they do. We passed another bill this session to make it so that I think it's if a doctor administers any kind of drug that has to do with abortion or anything, the doctor has to be present at the administration of that. So it's just a continuation of what we've done. We have a lot of legislators that like to say we are the front runner not only in the nation but in the world in this, and they like to keep that. Another big issue was one-time money and the use of one-time money, and that became quite a big sticker with the governor, with the House, with everyone. And what was one-time money versus reoccurring money and the definition of that, and where can you use it? You can't use one-time money to pay for reoccurring expenses. I understand all that, but I can tell you that it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it didn't make a lot of sense to a number of senators that sat around and talked about what we're doing is almost destroying things like health care, like higher education, and we've got this big pool of money over here in the bank drawing interest, and we can't touch it. That'd be one-time money. And their idea was, if we've got the money, let's keep things going. The other side says, no, that's one-time money. That's over there in a savings account. You can't touch it. Well, we actually didn't touch it, but that was a big issue that kept cropping up. And I think it's something that you will see over and over again. We also went through it that Professor talked about the Affordable Care Act and not taking Medicaid or Medicare money. And I don't know how much that was, 350 million or so, somewhere in that neighborhood. Well, I can assure you there are 49 other states will be more than happy to learn that we didn't take it, because they are going to be in line to take it. The law's there, and it reminds me, Butch and I were talking about on the way over here, reminds back in the days when Earl Long was governor and Leander Perez was griping about something that the feds were making him do, and Earl reminded him that the federal government had the atomic bomb. That's true. The law's been passed. It's there. I mean, we can play all the games we want and resist it, but all it does is hurts our citizens. It hurts us, nobody else. somebody's going to take it. The other thing that I will mention that I thought was a great idea, and it came from Butch Spear. Butch and I are custodians of public records. I'm the custodian of the public record for the Senate. Butch is the custodian of public record for the House. And we get requests for public records every day, tons of them. And Butch called me one day and told me he was putting on his internet, and the House has got one of the finest web pages in the country. They've received rewards from it. I give the credit to Butch. He did a lot of work on that. And he put together quite a really good page of explaining how you get a public record. And not only that, but we do get public record requests for things that have nothing to do with the Senate or the House. And so we have to respond back to them and explain, we are not the custodian of that record. This is where you have to go for it. So Butch went to a lot of pains to put that together and put it on the website so that someone wanting a public record, they can go on the website from the House, they see what it is, if it's something that's from the House, how you get it. I have to admit, I first told him no, I wasn't going to do that. I had my staff who came back and said, man, this is a great idea. And it really was a great idea, and all I had to do was copy what Butch did. I have put that's going on my website, and it became such a good idea, we actually passed a law that requires that for every public body, that every public entity out there has to create that on their website so that the general public, if they're wanting, like from the Commissioner of Insurance, or insurance public record, it will be on his website of who you contact, how you contact, and what do you do. So that was a few of the things that we did, and I guess we'll hear it for public comment later.
It's so nice to see the House and Senate getting along together. Our next speaker is the Clerk of the House, Butch Spear, and kudos to Butch for that page.
Well, thank you. Glenn and I have always got along. 41 years we've been getting along. And I've tried to, we showed up on the, this doesn't work. We showed up on the first day of the 1972 session, the day before Edwin Edwards took his oath of office for the governor for the first time. I've been trying to talk Glenn into not leaving the Senate until I leave the House. He's loath to agree to that because he was afraid I'm going to die there. Too many of my predecessors have chosen that path out of that office. So I pledged to him that I plan to be a formerly living clerk. Dr. Samuels talked about hubris, and he talked about what that has done to our current governor's programs and his attitudes. I want to bring to you a different point of view about what is going on in the relationship between the legislature and the governor, and it comes from the point of view which is particular to the House of term limits. When Governor Jindal was elected and sworn in as governor, he was inheriting a House of Representatives that had just had 58 members elected for the first time. The second largest class of newly elected legislators ever. We also inherited a former senator in Noble Ellington, who has gone on to much better things in working with the Department of Insurance. But Noble had been in the House for close to 20 years, I think, before you went to the Senate for 8? Just 8? Yeah. Gee, it seems like you've met. Anyway. So he was in the legislature for 20, and 8 in the House and 12 in the Senate, and then came back again to the House and realized that it wasn't the same, it wasn't your old state house any longer. Well, when Governor Jindal takes over, the House has 58 brand new members. I think we had a whopping 13 members who were in their were beginning their third term in the legislature. And so this is a fertile field for executive overreach, and it worked pretty well for him. Well, his first year, there was extra money to spend. Well, that always works well for the governor of the legislature when all you're really fighting about is do Do you drop 40, 60, or 100 million in the UAL so that you can spend 800 million on a roads program because you've paid everything else? Well, soon thereafter, the monetary issues started going south. But my point about this is that the governor has never had a hard row to hoe in the House of Representatives because he's had an overwhelming majority of people there who had no idea what they were doing. And we're still on the job training, and we're trying to figure out what it meant, what all these jargon terms mean, and how the budget is actually put together, and how do I get a capital outlay project approved, and all of those small items of effective service that prior to term limits, members were able to accumulate over time by sitting, watching, participating, and talking to more experienced members. But when these people sat down for their first day in the House, they looked around themselves, and the people behind them were brand new, the people next to them were brand new, the person across the aisle was brand new, and the person in front of them were brand new. And so when somebody said, well, what did they just do? They all went, I don't know. And so the governor had 4 years of a fairly easy time convincing the House that every one of his ideas was a bright idea and should be followed. And in this way, he's no different than other governors. It's a lot easier to find a majority in a 20-member Senate. 2/3 of the Senate is the same size of number of people as are sitting at these rounds in here. That's 2/3 of the Senate. So you knock 6 of you out and you're talking about a majority. Well, if you need to just get 20 people to agree with you, it's a whole lot easier. It takes less effort, and it takes less compromise than it does when you're trying to corral 53 people who are all scattering in different directions, or are looking for the bathroom because nobody gave them that in the orientation. Like, where is the nearest where's the nearest door out of this room, because I just don't want to be here any longer. Well, then the governor gets reelected. That class shrinks a little bit, but it's now in its second term, and we bring in 30 more new people. And on top of that, then the governor decides that he's going to go and start playing on the national stage, and it becomes very obvious to everybody in the state, but particularly to people who are elected to the legislature who want attention from the executive, that there's nobody there to give them attention. And so he shouldn't find it surprising that it's been harder for him this term, because he's made it harder on himself. Now, some of what has happened this year in this kumbaya session of Republicans and Democrats, whether they be black or white Democrats or hawk or Jindalicista Republicans, and the Senate as a kind of a fifth party out there. Some of this, I know, was caused by the way the governor treated the legislature in the 2012 session about the education issues and about the budget issues. And by running roughshod over the legislature on his education reform package, he incurred a huge amount of enmity with individual members of the House of Representatives. They felt abused. They felt they had no option but to vote with him, and yet they didn't get any kudos when they went home for being with the governor. And so he left them on that as well, because as soon as he passed those bills, he had a press conference and he went off to New Hampshire. And he was gone in New Hampshire and South Carolina and Iowa and Pennsylvania and Florida and Texas and California and Washington State and Washington, D.C. for the rest of last year. All the time members of the House particularly were hearing directly why what they did was not necessarily a good idea for the person that was talking to them. And so they were abandoned by the person that they hoped would take the heat for that decision, and they had to deal with it themselves. Also last year, if you recall, the budget was confected in the Senate, but was agreed to by the House because the fiscal hawks found that the governor could make a deal with the Democrats. And so the Jindalistas and the Democrats last year came together and made the deal to pass the Senate version of the budget. And after it was over and then the mid-year cuts happened for the 5th year in a row, the Democrats figured out that they had been lied to and that they had been left in the lurch and had signed on to a package that they really didn't want. And that all has led up to, so we're dealing with term limits, we're dealing with a governor that has a high degree of hubris, and we're dealing with how he handled the legislative session in 2012, and that has led up to what happened this year. And that is the hawk contingent of the Republicans grew in strength and became more solidified. The Democrats said, we're not dealing with you again because you can't be trusted. And that left the Gindelistas in the House to agree with him. And that worked to a point pretty much to about the second meeting of the Appropriations Committee in February. And then it fell apart for him and went downhill from there. So a lot of what happened this year about the budget process has been growing for the past 6 years, 5 years prior to this session. And the governor has brought it on himself. And whether or not this one works or not, we'll wait until December and the next set of mid-year cuts to find out whether the plan that was confected with all the arms around each other's shoulders and the backslapping and the high-fiving and the feeling good was worth it. So, but I will say that when Glenn and I started, there were 5 Republicans in the House of Representatives. So there really wasn't any, there were no issues of partisanship back then. And until Edwin Edwards was elected to his 3rd term, we still had 10, 11, less than 10 Republicans. When Edwards was elected to his 3rd term, a group of very conservative Democrats made a trek to the White House with Ronald Reagan, had a press event where they signed change cards, and we went from, I think it was 9 to 18 all in one day. And since then, we've been stumbling down the path of partisanship. I thought we were going to stumble down that path and end up just like Congress, and none of us who pay attention to politics or how to manage a legislature ever wants any organization to run the way the U.S. House of Representatives does. So it was very gratifying to me this year when the 2 parties realized that if they talked to one another, they could develop trust, because they couldn't do that with the governor, because you can't talk to the governor. You can talk to people who work for the governor, but you can't talk to the governor, so you can't develop a relationship of trust. But they ended up working together and developing trust that had nothing to do with a partisan position. They found that they could come to agreements, they could compromise, they stopped trying to get everything they ever wanted in life. They stopped being the 11-year-old at their birthday who counts their presents and said, I got one less than I got last year, and started being, accepting that there was another point of view that needed to be listened to, and that they could come together and make some improvements, not monumental ones. They didn't change the budget process to the point where it's always going to work in the future. My direct boss, who's the Speaker of the House, likened the budget process to the old car that is about to break down and you need to get rid of it and get a new one. Yes, but we didn't get rid of the old car. We put some duct tape around the holes, and we put some new oil in the engine, and we hope it won't smoke for very long, but we still have the same old car. Constitutional amendments, this is always something, I really was surprised Robert didn't talk about this. I thought this was